In the very heart of Europe, between the great rivers Dnieper and western Dvina, lies a land known to many as Belarus. This country, covering 207,600 square kilometers, 80,200 square miles, borders Russia to the east, Ukraine to the south, Poland to the west, and Lithuania and Latvia to the north. Today, approximately 9 million people live here, the majority of whom speak Belarusian and Russian. Modern Belarus is a republic with a presidential form of government, with the ancient city of Minsk as its capital. The country is known for its vast forests, which cover more than a third of its territory, picturesque lakes and marshes, and a rich cultural heritage. Belarus is often called the lungs of Europe, due to its pristine nature and nature reserves. But few know that this relatively small country has witnessed some of the most dramatic events in European history. The armies of Napoleon and Hitler marched through here, empires rose and fell, and the destinies of peoples and cultures intertwined over many centuries. The Belarusian lands witnessed the rise of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the horrors of the Holocaust, the triumph of partisan warfare, and the birth of an independent state. One of the most striking facts is that throughout its history, these lands have been part of numerous state entities, from ancient Slavic principalities to the Soviet Union. Yet the Belarusian people have managed to preserve their unique identity, language, and culture. This is the history of Belarus. Ancient roots and first principalities. Long before written records appeared, the territory of modern-day Belarus was inhabited by various tribes. Archaeological finds indicate that people lived here as early as the Neolithic era, approximately 6,000 years ago. Vast forests and numerous rivers created ideal conditions for hunting, fishing, and primitive agriculture. In the 1st centuries AD, these lands were settled by Baltic tribes, the ancestors of modern Lithuanians and Latvians. However, beginning in the 6th century, Slavic tribes began to penetrate the area, gradually assimilating or displacing the Balts. The main Slavic tribes inhabiting the Belarusian lands were the Krivichi in the north, the Dregovichi in the center, and the Radomiches in the east. These tribes lived in a clan-based system, engaging in agriculture, livestock breeding, hunting, and fishing. Their settlements were located along rivers, which served as major trade routes. Even at that time, the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks passed through here, linking Scandinavia with Byzantium via the Dnieper and its tributaries. By the 9th century, the first principalities began to form in the Belarusian lands. Polotsk, first mentioned in chronicles in 862, became one of the oldest cities in this territory. According to archaeological evidence, the settlement existed even earlier, with the fortified settlement founded around 780. The Polotsk Principality quickly grew in strength, thanks to its advantageous location at the crossroads of trade routes. The princes of Polotsk controlled trade between Novgorod and Kiev, collecting duties from merchant caravans. In the 10th century, the Principality of Polotsk achieved considerable power under the rule of Prince Rogvolod. However, his daughter Rogneda sparked a conflict with Prince Vladimir of Kiev, who forcibly took her as his wife after the murder of her father and brothers. This episode, described in ancient Russian chronicles, demonstrates the important role the Polotsk lands played in the political life of the time. The Christianization of the Belarusian lands began in the 10th century, although pagan beliefs persisted for a long time. In the 11th century, the Principality of Polotsk experienced a golden age under the reign of Prince Vseslav the Sorcerer, who ruled for 57 years. Vseslav was not only a successful military leader, but also a patron of culture and education. It was during this time that St. Sophia's Church was built in Polotsk, the third after Kiev and Novgorod, emphasizing the city's importance. Under Vseslav, the Principality of Polotsk stretched from the Baltic Sea to the upper Dnieper, competing with Kiev for influence in the region. However, by the end of the 11th century, the Principality of Polotsk began to fragment into smaller principalities. Minsk, Vitebsk, Drutsk, and other principalities emerged, each striving for independence. This fragmentation made the Belarusian lands vulnerable to external threats. The era of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the 13th century, brought new challenges to the Belarusian lands. German crusaders advanced from the west, the Mongol Tatars threatened from the east, and the Swedes raided from the north. Under these circumstances, the small principalities were unable to effectively counter external threats. Salvation came from an unexpected source. The Lithuanian tribes, long pagan and tribal, began to unite under the rule of Grand Dukes in the 13th century. Mindaugas, the first known Grand Duke of Lithuania, began to annex neighboring Slavic lands to his domain. The process of unification accelerated under Duke Gediminas in the first half of the 14th century. The Lithuanian princes did not directly conquer the Belarusian and Ukrainian lands. Rather, local princes voluntarily recognized their supremacy in exchange for protection from external enemies. This process became known as peaceful annexation. Thus arose the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, one of the largest states in medieval Europe. By the end of the 14th century, it stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, encompassing the territories of modern-day Lithuania, Belarus, most of Ukraine, and part of Russia. A striking feature of this state was that Lithuanians constituted a minority within it. The majority of the population was Slavic, the ancestors of modern Belarusians and Ukrainians. Moreover, the official language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was not Lithuanian, but Western Russian, the ancestor of modern Belarusian. Vilna, modern-day Vilnius, became the principality's center, but Belarus played a key role in the state's economic and cultural life. Belarusian cities, Polotsk, Vitebsk, Minsk, and Grodno, were important trade and craft centers. Various crafts developed here, and trade flourished with the Hanseatic League, Poland, and Russia. Under Grand Duke Vytautas, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania reached the height of its power in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Vytautas controlled a vast territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea and seriously considered creating his own empire. However, external threats forced the Lithuanian princes to seek allies. In 1385, the Union of Krevo was concluded between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. Grand Duke Jagiello of Lithuania became King of Poland, converting to Catholicism and taking the name Vladislav. This union had contradictory consequences for the Belarusian lands. On the one hand, it ensured protection from the Teutonic Order and the Grand Duchy of Moscow. On the other hand, it began the process of Polonization and Catholicization of the local nobility, which created tensions with the Orthodox population. The 15th and 16th centuries saw the flourishing of Belarusian culture within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was then that the Belarusian literary language developed and the first printed books appeared. Francisc Scarina, born in Polotsk around 1490, became the first printer in the East Slavic world. He published the Bible in Church Slavonic with elements of Belarusian, making books accessible to the common people. At this time, cities were actively developing in the Belarusian lands. Many of them were granted Magdeburg rights, which granted certain privileges to citizens and facilitated the development of trade and crafts. Craftsmen's guilds and trade guilds emerged, and banking flourished. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and religious contradictions. The 16th century brought further significant changes to the life of the Belarusian lands. In 1569, the Union of Lublin was concluded, finally uniting the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland into a single state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This union had far-reaching consequences for Belarus. Polish influence increased significantly, and the active Polonization of the local gentry began. Many members of the Belarusian nobility converted to Catholicism and adopted Polish culture and language, seeking to maintain their privileged position. However, the bulk of the population, peasants and townspeople, remained Orthodox and preserved Belarusian traditions. This created a deep rift in society along religious and cultural lines. The gentry increasingly distanced themselves from the common people, giving rise to social contradictions. The situation became even more complicated after the conclusion of the Brest Church Union in 1596. This union created the Greek Catholic Church, which preserved Orthodox rights but recognized the authority of the Pope. Officially, the union was aimed at reconciling Orthodox and Catholics, but in practice, It sparked intense religious conflict. Many Orthodox Christians perceived the union as a betrayal of the true faith. Brotherhoods, religious organizations that defended the rights of Orthodox Christians, opened schools, and published books in Belarusian emerged. The Vilnius Brotherhood, founded in 1584, became one of the centers of the Belarusian cultural revival. The 17th century proved particularly difficult for the Belarusian lands. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was drawn into a series of devastating wars. In 1648, the Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising began in Ukraine, quickly spreading to the Belarusian lands. Cossack troops devastated towns and villages, plundering churches and noble estates. Other powers soon intervened in the conflict. Russia supported the Cossacks, and Sweden attacked Poland from the north. Belarusian lands became the scene of fierce battles between various armies. This period, known as the Deluge, led to catastrophic consequences. The population of Belarus was reduced by almost half. Many cities were destroyed and burned. The economy collapsed, trade routes shifted to other regions. Cultural life came to a standstill. It took decades to heal the wounds of this terrible war. Nevertheless, a gradual recovery began in the second half of the 17th century. Cities were rebuilt, and crafts and trade were revived. The Jesuits played an active role in this process, founding schools and colleges. Vilnius University, founded in 1579, became an important center of education for the entire region. The 18th century brought new challenges. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth gradually weakened under the influence of internal contradictions and external pressure. Noble democracy, with its principle of liberum veto, paralyzed state governance. Neighboring powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, intervened increasingly in Poland's internal affairs, under the rule of the Russian Empire. The end of the 18th century marked a turning point for the Belarusian lands. As a result of three partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1772, 1793, and 1795, the territory of Belarus was annexed by the Russian Empire. Catherine the Great viewed these lands as originally Russian territories that were returned to the empire. A policy of integrating the Belarusian provinces into the Russian administrative system began. The Minsk, Mogilev, Vitebsk, Grodno, and Vilnius provinces were created. The Russian authorities pursued a consistent policy of Russification. Magdeburg rights were abolished, local privileges were abolished, and Russian legislation was introduced. Particular attention was paid to religious issues. The Uniate Church was subjected to constant pressure to eliminate it. Following the Kosciuszko uprising in 1794, in which Belarusians actively participated, the Russian authorities tightened their policies toward the local gentry. Many members of the Belarusian nobility were stripped of their noble rights and their estates confiscated. The issue of serfdom was particularly sensitive. While peasants in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had certain rights and could transfer their property from one landowner to another, Russian serfdom was much more restrictive. Peasants effectively became the property of their landowners. However, Russian rule also brought some positive changes. Road conditions improved, postal services developed, and new educational institutions were established. Gymnasiums and colleges opened in major cities, although instruction was conducted exclusively in Russian. The 19th century began with dramatic events for Belarus. In 1812, Napoleon's Grand Armée marched through Belarusian lands on its way to Russia. Many Belarusians, especially the gentry, pinned their hopes on the French emperor for the restoration of their independence. However, these hopes were not fulfilled. Napoleon viewed the Belarusian lands merely as a staging area for an offensive on Moscow. The war brought enormous destruction. The retreating French army plundered towns and villages, and partisan detachments attacked stragglers. After Napoleon's expulsion, Russian authorities further tightened their grip on the Belarusian provinces. Any signs of separatism were brutally suppressed. In 1839, the Uniate Church was finally abolished, and its parishes were forcibly converted to Orthodoxy. The mid-19th century was marked by a growing national consciousness among Belarusians. The first works in the Belarusian language began to appear. Jan Chekhov collected and published Belarusian folk songs. Vincent Dunin Marcinkiewicz wrote the first plays in Belarusian. The uprising of 1863 was a significant milestone in the history of Belarus. Although the main events took place in Poland and Lithuania, the Belarusian provinces were also engulfed in the rebellion. The rebels demanded the restoration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth within the borders of 1772. The uprising was brutally suppressed. Thousands of participants were executed or exiled to Siberia. Estates confiscated from the rebellious gentry were handed over to Russian landowners. The use of the Belarusian language in official documents and public speeches was banned. After the uprising was suppressed, the Russian authorities embarked on a course of complete Russification of the region. The Belarusian language was declared a dialect of the Russian language, with no right to independent existence. The publication of books in Belarusian was banned, and national schools were closed. Nevertheless, Belarusian culture continued to develop underground. Traditional songs, fairy tales, and customs persisted. Catholic and Uniate priests secretly taught children Belarusian literacy. Gradually, a Belarusian intelligentsia emerged that fought for the rights of its people. Awakening of national consciousness. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a time of national awakening for Belarusians. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 contributed to social change. Peasants gained personal freedom, although the land question remained unresolved. The development of capitalism led to the growth of cities and the formation of a working class. Railways were built, factories and plants were established. Minsk, Gomel, and Vitebsk became industrial centers. However, the bulk of the population continued to live in the countryside and engage in agriculture. During this time, Belarusian writers and public figures became increasingly active. Franciszek Bogusiewicz called on Belarusians not to be ashamed of their language and culture. Janka Kupala and Jakub Kolas created works that became classics of Belarusian literature. The First Russian Revolution of 1905 gave impetus to the Belarusian national movement. The Belarusian Socialist Hromada was founded, the first political party advocating for the autonomy of Belarus within a democratic Russia. In 1906, the first Belarusian newspaper, Nasha Dolya, was published, though it was short-lived. Belarusian schools and cultural societies began to emerge. However, the Tsarist authorities harshly suppressed any manifestations of national activism. The First World War brought new trials for the Belarusian people. The western regions of Belarus became the scene of fierce battles between the Russian and German armies. The front passed through Baranovichi, causing enormous destruction and loss of life. Hundreds of thousands of Belarusians were mobilized into the Russian army. Many died on the battlefield. The economy collapsed and famine set in. Refugees from frontline areas migrated en masse to the eastern provinces. Under these conditions, revolutionary sentiments in society grew stronger. The February Revolution of 1917 was greeted with enthusiasm by Belarusians. They hoped that the fall of Tsarism would pave the way for national revival, revolution, and the establishment of Soviet power. The events of 1917 radically changed the fate of the Belarusian lands. Following the February Revolution, the Belarusian Rada, a body of national self-government, was established. The Rada advocated for the autonomy of Belarus within a democratic Russia. However, the October Revolution upset all plans. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in Petrograd, did not fully recognize the right of nations to self-determination. Civil war broke out between various political forces in Belarus. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, ceding a significant portion of Belarusian lands to Germany. The German authorities created a puppet Belarusian people's government, but it had no real power. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the situation changed again. In December 1918, the Belarusian People's Republic was proclaimed. This was the first independent Belarusian state in history. However, the BNR existed only on paper. Real power in the Belarusian lands shifted from one military formation to another. Reds and Whites, Poles and Germans, and various partisan detachments were in charge. In January 1919, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic was established, with its capital in Smolensk. However, by February, The advance of Polish troops forced the Soviet government to evacuate. Under the Treaty of Riga in 1921, Belarusian lands were divided between Soviet Russia and Poland. Western Belarus, including the cities of Grodno, Baranovichi, and Novorudak, was ceded to Poland. The eastern part became the basis for the re-establishment of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. The first years of Soviet rule in Belarus were marked by a policy of Belarusization. The Belarusian language was granted the status of an official language alongside Russian, Polish, and Hebrew. Belarusian schools were established, and books and newspapers were published in the native language. This policy gave a powerful impetus to the development of Belarusian culture. A galaxy of talented writers, poets, and artists emerged. Maxim Bogdanovich, who died in 1917, became a symbol of the Belarusian poetic revival. In 1922, the capital of the BSSR was moved from Smolensk to Minsk. The city began to grow and develop rapidly. New businesses, educational institutions, and cultural institutions were built. The new economic policy contributed to economic recovery after devastating wars. Industry and agriculture developed. Education levels rose. By the end of the 1920s, illiteracy had been largely eliminated. The Stalin era and its contradictions. Stalin's rise to power in the late 1920s radically changed policy toward the national republics. The course toward Belarusinization was abandoned. A policy of unification and centralization began. The collectivization of agriculture met with serious resistance from the Belarusian peasantry. Many peasants were unwilling to hand over their land and livestock to the collective farms. The authorities responded with harsh repression against the kulaks and subkulaks. Tens of thousands of Belarusian peasants were dispossessed and exiled to remote areas of the USSR. Many died en route or in exile. Agriculture collapsed, and famine set in. The 1930s were a time of mass repression. Representatives of the Belarusian intelligentsia, writers, scientists, and party workers came under attack. Accused of bourgeois nationalism and espionage, they were arrested and executed. Many prominent Belarusian cultural figures were among the victims of the repressions. Poet Maxim Tank narrowly escaped arrest. Writer Kuzma Chorny was repressed and died in a labor camp. The same fate befell many other talented people. At the same time, the Republic was undergoing intensive industrialization. New factories and plants were built, and heavy industry developed. Minsk was becoming a major industrial center. A workforce was being created from among former peasants. Despite the repressions, education and science continued to develop in the 1930s. The Academy of Sciences of the BSSR was established. New institutes and technical schools opened. The number of specialists with higher and secondary education increased. In 1939, part of Western Belarus was annexed to the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, BSSR, following the partition of Poland between the USSR and Germany. This reunification was seen as a restoration of historical justice. However, the annexation of the western regions was not without problems. The local population, living under a different political system, had difficulty adapting to the Soviet order. Deportations of undesirable elements to the eastern regions of the USSR began. Great Patriotic War, June 22, 1941, became a dark date in the history of Belarus. On that day, German troops invaded the Soviet Union, and Belarusian soil was the first to bear the brunt of the invaders. The German armies rapidly advanced deep into the Republic. The Soviet troops, caught off guard, were unable to mount effective resistance. Within a few days, the enemy captured Minsk, encircling large Red Army forces. By the end of August 1941, the entire territory of Belarus was occupied. A brutal occupation regime was established. The Nazis viewed Belarusians as subhumans, subject to extermination or enslavement. The General Commissariat of Ostland was established in the occupied territory. Belarusian lands were divided among various administrative units. A policy of colonization aimed at Germanizing the region was pursued. The fate of the Jewish population of Belarus was particularly tragic. The Nazis organized the systematic extermination of Jews. Ghettos were created where people were held in inhumane conditions and then executed en masse. The Katyn tragedy became a symbol of the suffering of the Belarusian people. On March 22, 1943, punitive forces burned the entire village, including children. In total, over 600 Belarusian villages were destroyed during the war. However, the Belarusian people did not submit to the occupiers. Partisan detachments began to form in the very first days of the war. Resistance bases were established in forests and swamps. The partisans attacked German garrisons, blew up railways, and destroyed ammunition depots. The partisan movement in Belarus became one of the most powerful in occupied Europe. By 1944, more than 370,000 people were fighting in the partisan ranks. They controlled significant territories, known as partisan territories. Among the heroes of the partisan war, the name of Konstantin Zaslonov holds a special place. This railway worker organized a sabotage group that blew up German trains. Zaslonov died in battle, but his comrades continued his work. The Minsk Underground, led by Vasily Kors and other patriots, dealt significant blows to the occupiers. The underground members distributed Sovinformbureau reports, helped prisoners of war escape from camps, and collected intelligence. The liberation of Belarusian lands began in 1944. Operation Bagration, one of the Red Army's largest offensives, was carried out in the summer. Within a few weeks, almost the entire republic was liberated. On July 3, 1944, Soviet troops entered Minsk. The day of the capital's liberation became a holiday for the entire Belarusian people. However, the joy of victory was overshadowed by the scale of destruction and loss of life. The war claimed the lives of 1 in 4 Belarusians. More than 2 million people perished, including civilians, prisoners of war, and partisans. Cities and villages, factories and schools, hospitals and theaters were destroyed. Post-war reconstruction. After the war, Belarus faced the enormous task of rebuilding its devastated economy. Nearly all major cities lay in ruins. Minsk was 80% destroyed. Many industrial enterprises were evacuated or destroyed. Reconstruction began immediately after liberation. Factories and plants, schools and hospitals, residential buildings, and cultural institutions rose from the ruins. The entire Soviet people participated in this work. Specialists from other republics were sent to Belarus, and material resources were allocated. Particular attention was paid to industrial restoration. New industries were created, including mechanical engineering, chemicals, and electronics. Belarusian factories produced tractors and cars, refrigerators and televisions, machine tools and equipment. By the end of the 1940s, pre-war industrial production levels had not only been restored, but surpassed. Belarus was transforming into an industrial republic with a developed industry and modern infrastructure. Much attention was paid to the development of agriculture. Destroyed collective farms were rebuilt, machine and tractor stations were established, and new agricultural technologies were introduced. Belarusian lands once again began to yield good harvests. Science and education developed rapidly. The Academy of Sciences was re-established, and new institutes and universities were opened. Belarusian scientists made significant contributions to the development of physics and mathematics, biology and chemistry, and the technical sciences. The 1950s and 1960s saw a flourishing of Belarusian culture. A galaxy of talented writers and poets emerged, including Ivan Shamayakin, Ivan Melej, Arkady Kuleshov, and Ryhor Borodulin. Their works received recognition not only within the Republic, but also far beyond its borders. Belarusian cinema also experienced a boom. Films like Alpine Ballad, I Come From Childhood, and The Red Bow received international acclaim. Belarusian directors Viktor Turov and Roland Bykov created works that remain beloved by audiences today. In the 1970s and 1980s, Belarus continued to develop as an important component of the USSR. The Republic became a major industrial center with developed mechanical engineering, chemical, and light industries. Belarusian enterprises manufactured products that were supplied throughout the Soviet Union and exported abroad. MAZ and Belaz produced heavy trucks and quarry dump trucks. Gorizont manufactured televisions and radios. Minsk had become a modern city with a population of over 1 million. New residential areas were built, and a developed infrastructure was established. The metro, opened in 1984, became the capital's pride. Chernobyl disaster. April 26, 1986, was a tragic date not only for Belarus but for the entire world. On that day, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located in neighboring Ukraine, suffered an accident, but the radioactive cloud blanketed a significant portion of Belarusian territory. The consequences of the disaster for Belarus were catastrophic. 23% of the republic's territory, home to over 2 million people, was contaminated with radioactive contamination. The Gomel and Mogilev regions were particularly hard hit. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homes and relocate to other areas. Entire villages and towns were turned into exclusion zones. Agriculture in contaminated areas collapsed. The Chernobyl tragedy had not only environmental, but also socio-political consequences. The initial suppression of the scale of the disaster and attempts to hide the truth from the public undermined trust in the authorities. People began to question the competence of the country's leadership. At this time, perestroika, proclaimed by Mikhail Gorbachev, was gaining momentum in the USSR. The policy of glasnost allowed for open discussion of previously hushed-up issues. In Belarus, social movements advocating for the democratization of society gained momentum. The path to independence. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a time of dramatic change in the lives of the Belarusian people. The wave of democratic reforms that swept across Eastern Europe did not bypass Belarus. In 1988, the Belarusian Popular Front Revival was founded, a mass public organization advocating for national revival and democratic reforms. The BPF organized rallies and demonstrations, demanding that Belarusian be designated the sole state language. A significant milestone was the adoption of the language law in 1990, which declared Belarusian the state language and Russian the language of interethnic communication. This decision sparked heated debate in society. The events of August 1991 in Moscow hastened the collapse of the USSR. The Belarusian parliament rejected the State Emergency Committee and adopted a declaration of state sovereignty. On August 25th, the independence of the Republic of Belarus was proclaimed. Stanislav Shushkevich, elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet, became the first president of independent Belarus. Together with the leaders of Russia and Ukraine, he signed the agreement in Belovezhskaya Pushcha to dissolve the USSR and establish the Commonwealth of Independent States. The early 1990s were a time of great hope and severe trials. The transition to a market economy was painful. Inflation and economic decline set in. Many businesses closed and unemployment rose. Under these conditions, nostalgic sentiments for the Soviet past grew stronger in society. In the presidential elections of 1994, Alexander Lukashenko won, promising to restore order and halt the economic collapse. Modern Belarus. Since Alexander Lukashenko's rise to power, an authoritarian political system has been established in Belarus. Many democratic institutions have been curtailed, the rights of the opposition have been restricted, and control over the media has been tightened. In 1995, a referendum was held in which the majority of citizens voted in favor of granting Russian the status of a state language on par with Belarusian, for changing state symbols, and for economic integration with Russia. Economic policy was aimed at preserving the public sector and social guarantees. Many enterprises remained state-owned, and the centralized planning system was maintained. This prevented a sharp decline in living standards, but slowed the structural transformation of the economy. In 1999, the treaty establishing the Union State of Belarus and Russia was signed. It envisioned deep integration between the two countries in the economic, political, and military spheres. However, the actual results of this project were limited. The 2000s were characterized by relative political stability and economic growth. Thanks to high oil and gas prices, as well as preferential energy supplies from Russia, the Belarusian economy performed well. However, by the late 2000s, problems with the economic model began to emerge. The low efficiency of state-owned enterprises, dependence on Russian energy resources, and limited opportunities for innovation created obstacles to further development. In the 2010s, Belarus experienced repeated economic crises, accompanied by the devaluation of the national currency and a decline in living standards. The authorities were forced to implement structural reforms, but their scope remained limited. The presidential elections of 2020 marked a turning point in Belarus's modern history. The election results, which showed Alexander Lukashenko receiving over 80% of the vote, were questioned by the opposition and international observers. Mass protests followed, lasting for several months. Demonstrators demanded a recount of the votes, the release of political prisoners, and new, fair elections. The protests were brutally suppressed, with thousands of people arrested. Many opposition leaders, including presidential candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, were forced to flee the country. The international community did not recognize the election results and imposed sanctions against the Belarusian authorities. The events of 2020 significantly altered Belarus's international standing. Relations with Western countries deteriorated sharply, while ties with Russia, on the contrary, strengthened. Belarus found itself internationally isolated. Modern challenges and prospects. Today, Belarus faces serious challenges. The political crisis that began in 2020 remains unresolved. Society remains divided, and many active citizens have fled the country or are in prison. Economic problems also require solutions. Structural reforms, industrial modernization, and the development of new technologies are essential. Dependence on Russia for energy makes the economy vulnerable to external shocks. The demographic situation is worrying. The country's population is declining due to low birth rates and emigration. Young people are leaving the country at an especially high rate, creating challenges for future development. Nevertheless, Belarus also has significant advantages. These include a highly educated population, a developed industry, and a favorable geographical location in the center of Europe. Belarusians are traditionally distinguished by their hard work, peacefulness, and commitment to justice. Belarusian culture continues to thrive despite political difficulties. New talented writers, artists, and musicians are emerging. The Belarusian language is experiencing a renaissance of sorts, especially among young people. Information technology has become one of the most dynamically developing sectors of the Belarusian economy. The high-tech park in Minsk attracts specialists from all over the world. Belarusian IT companies successfully compete in the international market. The history of Belarus is the history of an amazing people who have managed to preserve their identity throughout the centuries, despite all trials and upheavals. From ancient Slavic tribes to the modern state, it has been a long and arduous journey, full of dramatic twists and turns. The Belarusian lands have witnessed the rise and fall of great powers, triumphs and tragedies, wars and peace. Here, the destinies of various peoples and cultures have intertwined, creating a unique historical mosaic. A distinctive feature of Belarusian history is that the Belarusian people have rarely been masters of their own destiny. For centuries, these lands were under the rule of various states, from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the Soviet Union. It was only at the end of the 20th century that Belarusians gained the opportunity to build an independent state. The path to independence was not easy. Political crises, economic difficulties, and social contradictions, the young state had to contend with all these challenges. Not all of them were successfully resolved, and many questions remain open to this day. However, history teaches us that the most difficult trials forge a people's character. Belarusians have survived the Tatar-Mongol invasions and the Crusaders, the wars of the 17th century and the Napoleonic invasion, Stalin's repressions, and the Nazi occupation. And each time, they found the strength to rise and continue living. The tragedy of the Great Patriotic War demonstrated the heroism and resilience of the Belarusian people. The partisan movement in the Belarusian forests became legendary. The memory of the war still unites Belarusians, reminding them of the price of peace and freedom. The Chernobyl disaster was another difficult test. But here, too, Belarusians demonstrated courage and solidarity, helping the victims, rebuilding the destroyed, and never losing faith in the future. Today, Belarus is experiencing another turning point in its history. Society is searching for paths to development, new forms of organizing political and economic life. This search isn't always smooth, but it testifies to the nation's vitality. History shows that the Belarusian people have always strived for justice, freedom, and a better life for their children. These aspirations have not disappeared today. They will be realized in the future, no matter what difficulties must be overcome. Belarusian history is rich in lessons. It teaches us to value peace and stability, but not to forget freedom and dignity. It demonstrates the importance of unity and solidarity, but warns against blindly following populist slogans. Perhaps the most important lesson of Belarusian history is that a nation is more than just the population of a particular territory. A nation is a community of people united by a common culture, language, historical traditions, and aspirations for a better future. And as long as this community exists, so does the nation, regardless of the political boundaries drawn on maps. Today, Belarus is a country with a rich historical heritage and great potential. It has everything it needs for successful development: an educated population, a developed industry, cultural traditions, and a favorable geographical location. The key is to find the wisdom and will to utilize these advantages. History doesn't end today. It continues, and each new generation of Belarusians contributes to its writing. The next chapter of this story depends on the choices made today by the people of this remarkable country in the heart of Europe. Studying history helps us better understand the present and prepare for the future. The history of Belarus is more than just a sequence of events and dates. It is the living memory of a people, their joys and sorrows, their dreams and achievements. And this memory must be preserved for future generations, so they know where they came from and where they are going. Ultimately, history is who we are, our actions, our choices, our aspirations. We don't just study history, we create it every day. And how we do so determines the mark we leave on those who come after us. What do you think of this amazing story of the Belarusian people? Which moments did you find most interesting or important? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinions. And if you found this story about Belarus informative, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We have many more fascinating stories about different countries to come.